In what year did America really begin? It depends what you mean by America. If America is the story of freedom and democracy, you could argue that America really began with the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s, since before then, a large portion of American citizens were denied that basic democratic freedom. Some other candidates for the beginning of America could be women's suffrage in 1920, the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870, which said the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Maybe it was the ratification of the US Constitution in 1789. Maybe it was the Declaration of Independence in July of 1776. And some even go back to the founding of the colonies. The Puritans seeking religious freedom and landing at Plymouth Rock in 1620, or the first Virginia colonies beginning in the 1580s. 2 years ago, in August of 2019, a new year was proposed for the beginning of America. And that year that was proposed was 1619. Why 1619? 1619 saw the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in the Jamestown colony in Virginia. Now, even before 1619, there had been African slaves in the so-called New World, in Spanish, Dutch, and Portuguese colonies, in South America, in the Caribbean, and even in the future Florida and South Carolina, so even in what would become the United States. But for Anglo-American history, marking 1619 as the beginning meant changing the narrative. Now, America's story is not simply a tale of freedom and democracy. It is also a story of oppression, suffering, maybe even predatory capitalism, depending on how far you want to go. The truth is that real history is messy. We think of history as a simple narrative of what actually happened. But our controversies in recent years over fake news, or in a musical, who lives, who dies, who tells your story, these questions go back to the beginning of written history. Around the year 700 BCE, the Assyrian king Sennacherib besieged Jerusalem. And we have accounts, written accounts, in both Assyrian records and in the Hebrew Bible's Book of Kings. And when you read both accounts, you say to yourself, are they describing the same event? They're happening at the same year with the same characters, but it sounds like very different stories. Was the bloody conflict that took place in North America between 1861 and 1865 the Civil War, or was it the War of Northern Aggression? Was the Jewish dispersion from their Near Eastern origins an organic diaspora, a spreading of seeds that took root naturally in new soil? Or was this dispersion a violent galut, a forcible exile by hostile conquerors? If there have been two sides to a conflict, there have been at least two versions of the story of what actually happened. Any parent of more than one child is very familiar with this basic truth. Now today, May 14th, is one of those days with multiple stories. For the British, it was the end of their 30-year League of Nations mandated rule over a territory called Palestine, with all the headaches that it produced. But for the Jewish and the Arab populations of that territory, and for the heirs of those people, it was a day of new beginnings in starkly different directions we still see playing out today. May 14th of 1948 was both an Independence Day, to be marked on the Jewish calendar anniversary, celebrating the establishment of the Jewish state of Israel. And it was also the eve of Nakba, of Catastrophe Day, to be marked on May 15th in the general calendar, remembering the beginning of Palestinian exile. Each of these narratives was enshrined in a founding document of the respective sides. And so we'll take a look at both of these stories as they were presented by these peoples. First, looking at the Israeli Declaration of Independence, or what they call the Megillat HaAtzmaut, the Scroll of Independence, which was issued on May 14th, 1948. And then we will see the Palestinian narrative as embodied in the original charter of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was issued in July of 1968, so 20 years later. I will note that the Palestinian document was amended during the Oslo peace process to recognize Israel and to reject armed struggle, and so those clauses were made inoperative. But they were still issued in 1968 as part of the story they told. This is from the Israeli Declaration of Independence. Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. Here they first attained to statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books. After being forcibly exiled from their land, the people kept faith with it throughout their dispersion and never ceased to pray and hope for their return to it and the restoration in it of their political freedom. Impelled by this historic and traditional attachment, Jews strove in every successive generation to reestablish themselves in their ancient homeland. In recent decades, they returned in their masses. Pioneers, mapilim, immigrants coming to Eretz Israel in defiance of restrictive legislation, and defenders. They made deserts bloom, revived the Hebrew language, built villages and towns, created a thriving community, controlling its own economy and culture, loving peace but knowing how to defend itself, bringing the blessings of progress to all the country's inhabitants, and aspiring toward independent nationhood. The catastrophe which befell the Jewish people, the massacre of millions of Jews in Europe, was another clear demonstration of the urgency of solving the problem of its homelessness by reestablishing in Eretz Israel the Jewish state, which would open the gates of the homeland wide to every Jew and confer upon the Jewish people the status of a fully privileged member of the comity of nations. Survivors of the Nazi Holocaust in Europe, as well as Jews from other parts of the world, continued to migrate to Eretz Israel, undaunted by difficulties, restrictions, and dangers, and never ceased to assert their right to a life of dignity, freedom, and honest toil in their national homeland. In the Second World War, the Jewish community of this country contributed its full share to the struggle of the freedom and peace-loving nations against the forces of Nazi wickedness. And finally, this right is the natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate, like all other nations, in their own sovereign state. This is an affirmation of rights, of national rights, and also of a return to a homeland. Now we see the narrative of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Article 1. Palestine is the homeland of the Arab Palestinian people. It is an indivisible part of the Arab homeland, and the Palestinian people are an integral part of the Arab nation. Palestine, with the boundaries it had during the British Mandate, is an indivisible territorial unit. The Palestinian Arab people possess the legal right to their homeland and have the right to determine their destiny after achieving the liberation of their country in accordance with their wishes and entirely of their own accord and will. The Palestinian identity is a genuine, essential, and inherent characteristic. It is passed from parents to children. The Zionist occupation and dispersal of the Palestinian Arab people through the disasters which befell them do not make them lose their Palestinian identity and their membership in the Palestinian community, nor do they negate them. The Palestinians are those Arab nationals who until 1947 normally resided in Palestine, regardless of whether they were evicted from it or have stayed there. Anyone born after that date of a Palestinian father, whether inside Palestine or outside of it, is also a Palestinian. And Jews who had normally resided in Palestine until the beginning of the Zionist invasion will be considered Palestinians. That there is a Palestinian community and that it has material, spiritual, and historical connection with Palestine are indisputable facts. The Palestinian child should be brought up in a revolutionary manner. He must be prepared for the armed struggle and ready to sacrifice his wealth and his life in order to win back its homeland and bring about its liberation. I hope you hear from this already. The differing perspective on what it meant for those early Jews in the Zionist movement to be moving to this land beginning in the 1880s, presented radically differently from a Palestinian perspective. Armed struggle is not the only way to liberate Palestine. This is the overall strategy, not merely a tactical phase. The Palestinian people assert their right to absolute determination and firm resolution to continue their armed struggle and work for a popular armed rebellion for the liberation of their country and their return to it. They also assert their right to normal life in Palestine and to exercise their right to self-determination and sovereignty over it. The partition of Palestine in 1947, the establishment of the State of Israel are entirely illegal, regardless of the passage of time, because they were contrary to the will of the Palestinian people and their natural right in their homeland, and inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of the UN, particularly the right to self-determination. The Balfour Declaration, the British Mandate for Palestine, everything based on them are deemed null and void. Claims of historical or religious ties of Jews with Palestine are incompatible with the facts of history. Judaism, being a religion, is not an independent nationality, nor do Jews constitute a single nation with an identity of their own. They are citizens of the state to which they belong. And finally, the last one we'll look at. Zionism is a political movement organically associated with international imperialism and antagonistic to all actions for liberation and to progressive movements in the world. It is racist and fanatic in its nature, aggressive, expansionist, and colonial in its aims, and fascist in its methods. Israel is the instrument of the Zionist movement and a geographical base for world imperialism placed strategically in the midst of the Arab homeland to combat the hopes of the Arab nation for liberation, unity, and progress. Israel is a constant source of threat vis-a-vis peace in the Middle East and the whole world. Since the liberation of Palestine will destroy the Zionist and imperial presence and will contribute to the establishment of peace in the Middle East, the Palestinian people look for the support of all the progressive and peaceful forces and urge them all to offer the Palestinian people all aid and support in their just struggle for the liberation of their homeland. A very different tale of what happened to the land and what should happen to the land. When you read these two documents side by side in dialogue with each other, it feels a bit like a Rashomon experience, mutually contradictory stories. Could these both be true? Is the Zionist movement a political movement for national liberation on a people's ancestral homeland that culminated on May 14th of 1948? Or is Zionism a European colonialist initiative that continues to oppress the true natives of the land who had lived there for centuries and whose greatest injustice was perpetrated after May 14th, 1948? You see, the problem is that many details of what happened 73 years ago today can be marshaled to support either side. And many of them are all true at the same time. And very few people say all of them all at once. I'm going to try my best within the constraints of time, and I know it will not satisfy the partisans of either side. So here are some truths as I understand them. In 1947, the proposed United Nations partition did in fact give a greater percentage of the land of historic Palestine to the future Jewish state than to the proposed Arab state, based on the population that was currently there. Although I will note that a chunk of that Israeli Jewish land was the Negev desert, which was not particularly useful. And they also envisioned the Holocaust survivors living in displaced persons camps moving to the land of Israel after its formation. It is also true that in 1947, the Jewish side did accept the United Nations partition plan, as unrealistic as they thought it might be, and the Arab side did in fact reject it. It is also true that immediately after the declaration of Israeli independence, armies of several Arab nations did invade this state. They attacked and in some cases wiped out Jewish settlements, even in territory that had been demarcated for the Jewish state under the UN partition plan. It is also true that there were absolutely Palestinians who were expelled by Jewish armed forces during the 1948-49 war, who became the Palestinian refugees. Some of them wound up staying within Israel's boundaries post-1949 and became Israeli citizens eventually, or some were part of the Palestinian refugee population that was originally scattered among Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, including in what would become called the West Bank. Now, some of those villages that were destroyed and the population expelled had been cover for armed guerrilla bands attacking Jewish convoys to Jerusalem. And some of those villages were simply deemed strategically valuable, and so they were cleared. Now, it is also true that there were Palestinians who fled the path of war on their own. After all, if you hear an army is coming towards you, you might not want to stay, no matter whose army it is. Some of them fled out of legitimate fear. Some of them were encouraged to flee by Arab language media propaganda, highlighting Jewish atrocities, real and imagined, although the people that fled clearly anticipated returning. They brought, and in many cases, they still own today, the keys of their houses that are prized possessions. Now, even though what we today call the Gaza Strip and the West Bank were envisioned to be part of a new Palestinian state by that UN partition plan, after the 1949 ceasefire, Egypt took possession of the Gaza Strip, and Jordan took possession of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, including the Old City. And neither Jordan nor Egypt made any moves whatsoever to establish any kind of Palestinian self-government in those territories before the 1967 Six-Day War. So it's actually true that the West Bank and Gaza were occupied territory from 1949. They were just occupied by Jordan and Egypt instead of by Israel. Over the coming decades after 1948-49, Jewish refugees from Arab countries were often persecuted and despoiled of their property and expelled from Yemen and Iraq and Egypt and Syria and Morocco and many other countries. And those new immigrants to Israel, those refugees, were resettled in Israel, certainly with many challenges over the years. Today, those non-Ashkenazi, non-European Jews coming from Arab lands make up almost half of the Jewish population of the state of Israel. During that same time period, after the 48-49 war, Palestinians remained in UN refugee camps in the surrounding countries. They were not integrated into the surrounding populations. And many of them are still there, still in refugee camps, still identifying with the villages and regions of their origin, still hoping for a right of return to their historic land and even to their historic homes. It is also true that during that War of Independence, Israel, the Jewish state, lost a full 1% of its Jewish population during the War of Independence. Think of an American war that would cost 3 million casualties today. And that also included the destruction of all Jewish settlements that wound up on the other side of the 1949 Armistice Line, aka the Green Line. The Jordanians in charge of East Jerusalem made no attempt to allow Jews to visit their holy sites in the Old City, like the Western Wall or the Mount of Olives Historical Cemetery. And they even allowed some of those sites to be defaced and defamed from 1949 until 1967, when Israel reconquered East Jerusalem and the West Bank. In 1947, the partition plan assigned approximately a 60% Jewish majority to territory demarcated for the Jewish state. So there would have been about 400,000 Arabs, or about 40% of that territory. However, the end result of the 1949 ceasefire was a Jewish state that was almost 80% Jewish instead of 60%. And Moshe Sharet, one of the early politicians in charge of the state, at a meeting of the provisional government on June 16th, so just 1 month after that Declaration of Independence and all these population moves that had taken place, he said, and it's now been released from the archives, quote, "Had any of us said that one day we must get up and expel them all, it would have been considered madness. But if it came about during the upheavals of war, a war declared on us by the Arab nation, and as the Arabs themselves were fleeing, then it is one of those revolutionary changes after which history does not return to the status quo ante." From then on, Israeli army policy and Israeli government policy since then has mostly prevented Palestinian refugees from returning, and even wound up resettling many of those Jewish refugees from the DP camps in Arab countries in the so-called vacant properties. Of course, it also happened the other way. Similarly, there were Palestinian families who resettled in former Jewish homes and Jewish-owned properties in East Jerusalem, including in a region called Sheikh Jarrah, which has been in the news lately. In fact, there were Arab families housed in formerly Jewish-owned homes in this region of East Jerusalem. And since the reconquest of the land in the 1967 war, some of those organizations have tried to reclaim title to those lands and to expel the Arab tenants who had been there for many, many years. And this is part of the flashpoint of the initial conflict today. I will also point out, if you went back to 1948, it was the same era of mass population transfers in other parts of the world. In India and Pakistan, which were both formed in 1947, millions of people were on the move between both countries. And yes, it caused conflict and suffering and death and an ongoing conflict between those two countries, even to this day. Similarly, the borders of Russia and Poland and Germany were redrawn. Millions of Sudetenland Germans were expelled from the Czech Republic, back then Czechoslovakia. So it was par for the course to see populations moving in large numbers from one country to another in the 1940s. I will say, though, that those kind of population moves definitely privileged ethnic national self-determination rights over individual rights or claims to personal property. Now, finally, it is also true, just as Jews had a national consciousness during their exile, they were never purely a religious group, no matter what the Palestinian Liberation Organization charter said. So too did Palestinians deepen a national identity during their exile. And those who claim Palestinian identity is made up forget the fact that Israeli identity is relatively recent too. They were hoping for liberation by Arab national armies through war. Eventually, they took up arms themselves after the crushing 1967 defeats of Jordan, Syria, and Egypt. Some Palestinians have given up the hope of a full return, quote, from the river to the sea, i.e. with no Israel, with the beginning of the Oslo peace process in the 1990s, and others never gave up that dream. And still others in recent years have despaired of ever seeing an independent Palestine of any kind, given the realities changing and getting worse on the ground. So what is the meaning of May 14th in the story that history tells? It is a celebration and a crushing disaster. It is achievement and it is agony. It is an opportunity missed and an opportunity seized. It was a win and a loss. It sowed new seeds to feed a generations-long conflict, and it continues to echo in the tragic events we see playing out in the news even today. Unlike America, we are not debating what year or even what day to mark. It was May 14th, 1948. But like America, we continue to argue about what it all means, both for the past and for the future. I'd like to ask if you have any comments, thoughts, questions about these issues from the past, or certainly we can talk about issues going on in the present as well.
Wow, Rabbi, that was really a great summary of the situation from 1948 on. And I keep saying that there are no rights in this and there are no wrongs in this, that both sides have an equal stake in blame, that the Arab countries could have gone in and put in electricity and sewers and water on the West Bank and Gaza, and the Israelis could have gone in and put in electricity and sewer and water after 67. So no one is blameless in this, but both have, for lack of a better term, a tribal mentality of never forgetting and revenge and one of the reasons I left Israel was that I knew that if I stayed, I would be sending my husband and my son and my grandsons off to war, because I never saw how there could be a peace in this, how there can be a reconciliation. And I heard stories of my grandparents as part of a group of people who tried to bring reconciliation between the Arabs and the Jews in the 30s and in the early 40s. And I just couldn't see how that would happen. And I'm sorry to see that what I thought in 1975 has come true. So
there's an essay by the Israeli writer Aleph Bet Yehoshua called Between Right and Right. And it's, you could make the statement the opposite way. You said they're both wrong, but you could also say you're right and you're right. That they both have claims to rights, claims to homeland, claims to labor for the land, claims to loving the territory, claims to national self-determination. And unfortunately, those two rights are conflicting in the same space at times.
Can I jump in for a
Please,
comment?
please.
I think the issue really also has to be considered as to where do we go from here? Because if we only look at it from, okay, the past is very complicated. And as you say, there's validity on both sides. You have two nationalisms in one land, if you will. And you have culpability with the British promising things to everybody, and so forth and so on. But that's all in a way beside the point, because right now what we have is a situation, and the question is, how do we solve the situation? And I think there's two aspects to it. I mean, the first aspect is internally, that the two sides have to agree that each side has to give up something and which means a two-state solution, because that satisfies to some degree the nationalism of both sides, but it's never going to satisfy the aspirations of those who feel that they were ripped off. I mean, that's just not going to happen. But the other aspect of it is the external side of things, because what will cause peace at some point, as it did in South Africa, for example, is the beginning of the external actors who support each side to begin to draw away or pressure those sides to do something and to make some, because each side is heavily funded by outside actors. And whether it's there was the Soviets at one time, or if it's Iran, or it's the United States, and all those people in some ways have to start to withdraw that aid and say, you guys have to make up and do something and create something, because as long as we have vested interests in there, that's part of the problem. I don't have a solution to this. And, I mean, it's a very complicated issue. But to me, these are the two basic issues that have to go on. If there's an internal issue between the two sides that has to accept a modicum of compromise, and then there is the external actors who have to get their fingers out of it and stop trying to push these sides to do things for their own specific interests.
Laurie, I will take issue with one thing you said at the beginning.
Okay.
Where you said the past doesn't matter. We need to move forward. And I think that's not true, because unless you hear the other story, unless you hear the other side of what happened in the past, you're never going to give up any of your claims. If all you've heard is your own story over and over again, then why would you give up something to those liars and those people who are terrorists and those people who are colonists? And you don't hear the other person's side of the story to concede that they have some right and some claim. And so, I don't think it's the case that we can get away from looking back at that past and finding a way to share that story. I mean, you mentioned South Africa. One of the most important innovations they put in place was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was a way of moving forward by hearing what had actually happened. You needed to go back and share that story. What are we doing in America right now? Talking about the legacy of slavery and the legacy of Jim Crow and it didn't end in 1865. It didn't end in 1870. It didn't end in 1964. But we have to tell those stories and understand the real history of the discrimination involved in the GI Bill and the mortgage lending. And so we need to know that history to understand the present and to be willing to make changes in the present based on the inheritance of the past. So I would argue that the history and hearing these stories is an important part. I don't disagree that we also have to look forward, and the other things you said I fully agree with. But we do have to hear the history at times too. I know.
I agree with you. I think I misstated myself there. Yeah,
that's fine. Judy, and then Susie.
You mentioned about the war of northern aggression, and the first time I heard that, we were in, I believe it was South Carolina, on a plantation tour, and I asked a question to the tour guide, something about the Civil War, and she said it was a war of northern aggression. There was nothing civil about it. And then, when we were there, we could not believe now this was, I think, in early 2000s, how many Confederate flags the businesses still had. And I said, Steve, I don't think they got over it. And I think it was only a few years ago that they started taking down Confederate flags and statues of Southern, but I have a feeling a lot of people down there are still pro-Confederacy. I mean, it hasn't changed.
Well, I mean, Jews have lost wars in the past, and we still remember it for a long time too. You know, one of the Serbian national defeats was in 1356 or something, and they're still angry about it. So, you know, 150 years is nothing in the scale of grudges. Go ahead, Susie.
Yeah, I often think of that point you made and have made about the grudges. I think that it's not correct that history doesn't matter, but the answers and the needs aren't addressed to be found in history. History matters because they're part of where we've become and what we need to deal with. But the thing about history is everybody's got a just claim if you take it to where their just claim started. If you go a little bit farther, they don't have the just claim, somebody else does. And it's important to understand that, but that's not going to provide an answer. You're always going to be able to go back another level and have another just claim. So that's where I agree with Lori, that the answers are in the future, although the history on how we got there and need to find them is very important as well. But we can always go back farther. I mean, you go back far enough, and yes, the Jews had the land, or the populations that evolved into today's Jews. But you go back farther, and it was somebody else. And they might not have preserved their continuity to be a recognized population today, but that doesn't mean that what happened when they lost the land wasn't important and wasn't meaningful.
I do want to mention one other thing, and then Rich, and then Leora. You know, some of the hearing the stories is also about emotions. It's about the other person feeling heard and acknowledged, to have their experience affirmed. You know, when you're in marriage counseling, one of the things the counselor will do is have you repeat back what the other person just said, to make sure you were listening, and to make sure you understood it, to make sure you heard their story and what they were feeling and what their perspective was. And until you can do that, you can't build even a working relationship until you're on the same page. You can hear what the other person has to say. So that's where, again, I think these narratives are important. I think it's important at a Shabbat service to hear these versions from the Palestinian Liberation Organization charter, which, you know, many Jews have never read or never heard. And it's important to hear both sides of that story for our own mind opening, to be able to acknowledge the other person's perspective. Yes, please, Rich, unmute and go ahead.
One of the factors that is present here, and there's some, bear with me, some commonality between the situation in our own country, and that's the weak leadership. The leaders have their own interest. Their interest of staying in power far exceeds the interest of the folks that they're supposedly leading. It's their ego, their demand to, say, remain in power, and that's a solution that it's very hard to see happen. But it's valid in our own country, and it certainly has since the birth of Israel. There have been times when they were good leaders. It didn't ever seem that there were great leaders on both sides at the same time.
Right. Yep. Leora, are we going to jump in, and then Cindy?
Yeah. First of all, I disagree with you with one word. You kept talking about hearing, and I would substitute listening with attention and mindfulness, which we don't tend to do as human beings. That's a hard thing to do. Second, Lori talks about the two-state solution. As long as Jews, Orthodox Jews, are right, and it's their land because God gave it to them, and the settlements are accepted by the leadership in Israel and encouraged, you can't have two states, because if you look at where the settlements are, I mean, the country would be, there's no contiguous land. And so a two-state solution no longer, given the realities of the world today as it stands, the land as it stands, is no longer a solution. I don't believe that Jews should be in those settlements, should be in that land. It doesn't belong to us. It never did. We should get the hell out of there. But Rich is absolutely right. The leadership who's more interested in staying in power, I think the cult cult personality of leadership is no different there than it is here. They're not interested in peace. They're not interested in, one of the problems with Netanyahu forming a coalition government is that the ultra-right were upset with him because he wasn't hard enough on the Arabs. Well, now you look at it and he's being really hard on the Arabs. So I'm kind of really cynical and saying, is this what's happening? He wants to stay in power. So I don't know how going forward we're going to come to reconciliation or peace, because in order to have reconciliation, you have to listen, and neither side is willing to listen. So
I'll also add that the Palestinians are thinking of elections coming up this year as well, and Hamas has opened its campaign as the defenders of Palestinian honor via rocket. Cindy, you're up.
So one of the things that came up earlier today in a conversation about this with a friend and some of her friends, is a topic that comes up often enough in our discussions, and what it means to be Jewish and what it means to have that identity. And as Westerners, we can very easily compartmentalize being, culturally Jewish versus religious versus, a political nation of, Israel. And so I think that our perspective is a little challenged when we try to kind of supplant that into, another location that doesn't really have that same separation. And, it's complicated. If we were to say that, Italy is mostly Catholic, so Italy is now Catholic, and, and Catholic is going to rule everything. And, they've been here for, thousands of years, and so they'll always be here, they'll always be Catholic, and everybody else would kind of look at you and go, that doesn't work. But when it comes to that, kind of little pocket of the world, it gets so complicated and so muddy over, who's been here the longest, who has the biggest right. As someone else mentioned, if you go back far enough, you can always find someone else who has claim to the land. The article shared today that my friend shared that spawned this was, well, 2,000 years ago, it belonged to the Jews, so of course it's theirs. And I thought, well, okay, 140 years ago, my family was run out of Ukraine. So during the pogroms, so can we just waltz back in and say, okay, you know what? My family was pushed out of here. This is now my home. There are going to be opinions about that, and it's complicated.
I would ask that friend if they know what Native American tribe's land they are living on right now.
Yeah, this particular friend probably would know, but
yeah,
very largely most of us don't.
But this is, this is an interesting question. I did a program on Thursday for our congregation in Toronto. And one of the things they do at the beginning of all their events is they read an acknowledgement of on which Native tribes' land they are living and doing their programming, as a sort of acceptance of the fact that that the land was taken from those peoples. And I thought it was a very interesting sort of awareness raising routine to their event as a way of making a statement that they have an obligation to try to provide some kind of restorative justice given that reality. And if we all did that, might our perspective be different on whose it was originally and who gets it now? Well, who knows?